Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. So today we'll be looking at critical reasoning and we'll be touching on the reason why we always say not to focus a lot on specific question types, but your general approach to critical reasoning. So we'll be talking and showing why that's the case and why just having a good approach to CR in general may help you even solve questions without really considering the question type. So we know critical reasoning has many question types. So the main ones are about 8. And the approach to these questions varies slightly with each question type. But even though they vary, the fundamentals of CR remain the same. So once you get the fundamentals right for CR, even if a question type that you do not know of comes along, you will be able to easily solve this question. And in this video, we'll be showing how these questions are all similar. They just extract the questions or what they need from you in a different way. So how do we normally approach verbal reasoning questions? So one, we know we need a lot of attention to detail because one word makes all the difference. So we need attention to detail, and the main aim is usually to understand the order's intended meaning. So this is where we have to be careful when paraphrasing. Say you need to paraphrase so that you can make this content that is provided to you easier to understand. So you have to be careful not to interpret the author's meaning, but to maintain that meaning even through your paraphrasing. So doing these two things, they give you an edge and it helps you solve verbal reasoning questions quite easily and confidently. So to determine how to approach a CR question, so we've talked about how to approach verbal reasoning questions. So to know how to approach a CR question, we need to know the components of a critical reasoning question. And basically, we have 3 parts to critical reasoning question. You have the stimulus, the question stem, and the answer choices. So from the answer choices, we know it's from A to E. The question stem is what is required of you by that specific critical reasoning question. And then when you go to the stimulus, we have 3 major parts. We have the premise. These can be referred to as a set of facts that are presented to you. Remember, when we are dealing with verbal reasoning, we only confine ourselves to what we are given. So if some of the facts in real life are missing, you assume that they do not exist. So these are the facts that you are allowed to consider when dealing with this critical reasoning question. And then we have the logic. Sometimes, most of the times, the logic is more or less unstated. But this is what links these facts to a conclusion. So given these facts, the author now draws a conclusion. So logic connects a premise and a conclusion or argument. So the differences in question types, they come from the variations and the presentations of these components, especially these 3. So the part that is missing or the part that is maybe presented in a different way, that's what really makes the difference between critical reasoning question types. And we're going to look how easily we can convert from one question type to the other, making it obvious that once you know what the premise is, so what you're taking us through, once you know the logic of how the author connected the premise and the conclusion, so the conclusion, which is the main argument or purpose of our stimulus. So once you know these three, no matter how the question then is phrased, you will easily be able to solve the question, even without thinking about what question type you're dealing with. So we will look at how all these three components interact and change according to question type. So our first question type here is weakening or strengthening the argument. So we know here we are dealing with the conclusion. So here the question requires you to strengthen an already given conclusion. And so if there is a conclusion, of course, there is premise and then logic. So how do you solve these questions? We just find an additional premise. So if this additional premise is taken or is added to the already existing premises, then the effective combination of the premise and the logic either strengthens the conclusion or weakens the conclusion. So especially if you look at weakening, you will find that sometimes this additional premise, it kind of tells us that there's a premise that wasn't really a fact. It was an assumed fact, which wasn't actually a fact. So that's weakening and strengthening the argument. You just need to find extra information that changes the conclusion according to what is needed, either weakening the argument or strengthening the argument. Going on to assumption questions, these require finding an unstated premise, which the conclusion depends on. So remember, if we have a conclusion, there should be logic behind it. So in assumption questions, we find that the way this logic is drawn, it has a gap. So this gap is what we are calling an unstated premise. So it's something that's not said that must be true for this conclusion to hold. So that's generally what an assumption means. So if we take an assumption and we insert it among our premises, then it reinforces our logic, it seals that logic gap, and hence the conclusion is strengthened. Because remember, for assumption questions, this unstated premise holds the conclusion. The conclusion depends on it to hold true.
You're watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, presented to you by Upstake America. Upstake America is a consulting company that helps immigrants find amazing higher education and job opportunities in the tech industry in the United States. You can find our programs by going to www.upstakeamerica.com. Upstake America, we wake you up to the unlimited potential.
On to our next question, inference questions. So remember, the stimulus usually has premise, logic, and conclusion. So in inference questions, they omit the conclusion. So you have a set of premises, and then you're supposed to figure out a conclusion. So how do you figure out a conclusion? So you find an answer choice where the information that you're given must be true, given the information you provided. So you're only missing a conclusion and you're supposed to draw a conclusion. So that conclusion is what we call an inference. So you are inferring from the information that you have. When we go to flow questions, We have our premise, our logic, and our conclusion. But this logic is inferred in a wrong way. So there is a mistake in that type of reasoning. And there are a number of ways in which there can be a flaw, either overlooking stated premise or making an assumption that isn't actually true, or simple things like mistaking cause for an effect or the opposite of that. So when the logic that's used to draw our conclusion is flawed or has a mistake, then that's where flaw questions come in. We're supposed to find that inconsistency. So where is this logic lacking, or where is this logic wrong, and why is the conclusion not really correct given the logic that you have? So as I've said, it requires finding an inconsistency or mistake in the logic that leads to a specific conclusion. For instance, if you find a premise that was actually an assumption. So if in drawing this conclusion, the logic used took an assumption as truth, but it actually wasn't truth. So you have found yourself a flaw in that question. Next, we have paradox questions. Again, these are framed a bit differently. So we usually have scenarios. So you have either two scenarios that are opposite, or you have an event that should lead to a certain result, but it results to the opposite result. So the result that we get is opposite of what we expected. So here, what do we have? We have knowing this event happens, then we know, say, result one should happen. So if you think about this, we have our premise here, and then we have a conclusion. But somehow we have a conclusion that is opposite of what you could or you would have normally drawn from the information that you have. So you're supposed to figure out the logic behind this opposite conclusion. So what would make the conclusion be not as expected? So this means now, again, bridging a logic gap, because there is something missing that we do not know. So it requires you to find an additional premise that validates this conclusion. So once you find that premise, then the premise now will help you build this logic that will now explain why the conclusion is as it is and not as expected. So again, you can see we are playing with premise, logic, and conclusion. So it's done by finding a viable additional premise that's not presenting the stimulus. So we'll go to evaluate the argument questions. They require finding a way to check if an argument is true or false. So we have our normal structure. We have premise, logic, and our conclusion. So this time we need to test if our conclusion is actually true or not. So it doesn't really matter if the results of this test, as long as it helps us know for sure if the conclusion is correct or incorrect. So it's a test to determine if the logic of this argument is valid, because for you to have an argument, you have to have a logic behind it. So this test kind of validates the logic or invalidates the logic. So that's evaluate the argument questions. You kind of look for a test or experiment to determine the truth of the conclusion, and hence, of course, the logic behind that conclusion. So our two last question types. So identifying the reasoning. So this simply is just that, figuring out the logic. So we have seen questions where there is a premise missing. We have seen where there is a logic gap. We've seen where there is a conclusion missing. That's inference questions. So in this reasoning, we are missing the logic. So we have the premise, we have the conclusion. Now you're just supposed to find the logic behind this conclusion, kind of tying the premise to a conclusion. Then identifying the role. So these require identification of the role played by a phrase or sentence present in the premise. So to do this, you have to understand every component. And that's why we said to effectively answer CR questions, you have to know where the premise is, where the logic is, and where the conclusion is. Because if, say, a premise is the one that's bolded and you don't know that it's a premise, you think it's a conclusion, then you get it wrong. If, say, it's a conclusion that is bolded, then because you know how to break down the structure of the stimulus and CR questions, you can easily tell that this is a conclusion. So identifying the role just needs you to know how to spot the premise, the logic, and the conclusion, and probably any other maybe assumption that's presented, something of the sort. So knowing the interactions of these three things, so the premise, the logic, and the conclusion, just knowing how to play around with them, how the question or what the question needs you to do to these three will be a key ingredient in you being able to solve any critical reasoning question that comes your way. And remember, this is built on attention to detail, is built on knowing how to spot when an answer is out of the scope. That means that it's outside, it lays outside these premises that we are given. Knowing to spot wrong logic when the logic that's presented either in an answer choice or at the question doesn't really make sense. So you need a lot of attention to detail. And this comes with practice. So just keep on practicing, start with the easy questions. Once you are good with those, you can now upgrade to a medium and higher difficulty questions. And doing that, you will eventually find critical reasoning becomes becoming easy and easy. So that's all for our class today. So for more hints, you can always join our training, going to our website, kenyaelectprogram.com, and we will share these and more insights with you in our trainings. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next class. Bye.